Sounds good. Thought I'd just turn on my video for a little bit just so y'all can make sure that I am an actual person and not a chat bot. You never know these days. So just want to introduce myself. I'm an associate director here at SRS, and David asked me to kind of go over a little bit of how we determine what is and is not a gift or a grant. And it's sometimes it seems like it'd be simple, but once you get into the weeds, sometimes it gets a little more complicated. So I kind of want to go through today just a little bit of sort of the criteria that we use for determining, is something a gift or is it a grant? And I always like to use the analogy of, when you're giving a gift to your kids. Let's say you're giving a gift to, you're giving a car, and you say, hey, I'm going to give my teenager a car. If you give it to them and you ask a whole bunch of things in return, it stops being a gift. But, if they use that car for bad purposes and you take it back, that's still a cool tool. So I was just going to go into kind of, ways to determine, something's a gift or a grant. Basically, a grant is something that's reciprocal in nature. Both the donor and the recipient are both getting something out of it. The donor party is giving the funding to the institution, and they're receiving something of relatively equal value. But a gift is something that's given by a donor, and they don't expect anything significant of value in return, other than something like recognition or basically the disposition of the gift in accordance with their wishes. Gifts can have requirements that the money be spent for a specific purpose, and that's what we typically call a restricted research gift, but otherwise they shouldn't carry any other requirements. Next, I'll kind of go through sort of a list of factors that we use to determine what is a gift or what is a grant. One of the things that you can use to determine if it is a gift or a grant is the funding statement. Typically, if it's a gift, the donor will explicitly state that this is a gift and he or she intends this award to be a philanthropic gift. If it's a grant, typically it comes from a funding agency or a foundation or something like that, and they will state in the program announcement that the award is a grant. Another thing that you can use to determine whether something's a gift or a grant depends on the initiative for the project. Typically, if you have a gift, the initiative for the donation, it typically comes from the donor, but it may result from an individual here at Texas A&M, one of the system members, putting out a need or a wish for a specified gift in a specific area. So it can be both, but typically a grant is something that's initiated by the funding agency, and it comes from an RFP or a request for proposal, a program announcement, things like that, where they basically throw open and say, we would like to fund research in this area, please send your proposals. One of the other things that you can use to determine if something's a gift or a grant is how they want to handle technical and scientific data. If it's a gift, the funder does not require any kind of technical or scientific report to be given to them as a condition of the award. However, if it's a grant, this will typically require as a condition of the award that you submit reports on the technical and scientific findings of the research. Deliverables. If it's a gift, if there are any deliverables achieved, these typically would not be something that would benefit the funding agency or the foundation or the individual. If it's a grant, any deliverables that are anticipated to come out of this would actually benefit the funding agency, or they would be in line with their purpose. Now, one of the big things is intellectual property too. If it's a gift, the funding agency, individual, whatever, they're not going to make any claim on any patents, copyrights, or other intellectual property that might result from the activities that their gift would support. However, in a grant, the funding agency or individual or whatever can definitely make claims on patents, copyrights, and intellectual property rights that result from these activities. Another thing that you'll see that differs between gifts and grants is restricted provisions. If you have a gift, the funding agency or individual, they can request information related to the use of the funds, but they're not going to include any restricted provisions like we have to provide publications to them to review and comment on, or we have to give them rights in any property that's purchased with the funds or things of that nature. However, with the grant, those conditions can all be part of it, where they require review of proposals, they require delays on things, they require us to, give them at the end of the project to give them ownership of any property that's purchased with the funds, things of that nature. Equal value exchange. Basically, this is kind of what I had mentioned a little bit previously, in that a gift involves funds that are exchanged, that are given without the anticipation of an exchange of goods or services. There's no equal value exchange where the funding agency is receiving deliverables roughly equal to the funds that they're giving to the system member. There's no quid pro quo situation. However, with the grant, it is explicitly quid pro quo, and the funds that are received are for a specific purpose, and they anticipate getting something of value in return from the system member. Performance objective is another area to highlight, because basically, when you have a gift, the funder doesn't establish strict and non-negotiable performance objectives. There's not any specific time period. There's not any specific deliverables that we have to meet in order to receive the gift. That being said, a philanthropic gift can be restricted in nature. For instance, they can say this needs to be spent on a specific type of research, but it doesn't dictate how the work will be accomplished, and it doesn't have indications on return of unspent funds. Whereas a grant, the funding agency or individual establishes set performance objectives. There's a very specified period of time that's associated with use of the funds. So it has a predefined start and stop date. Another issue that comes up is penalties for non-performance. With a gift, the system member is not liable for any economic penalties associated with the donation. And the caveat to this is, sometimes with a gift, if they specify that this needs to be spent on a specific research area and we don't do that, then there could be conditions where, because we're not basically spending the gift as the individual intended. We might have to, figure out another place to put the gift and do what they requested with their funds. Whereas with a grant, there's definitely economic and punitive penalties if we don't meet the terms of the agreement and provide deliverables in a timely manner and things of that nature. Repayment of unspent funds. This is one of the things that sometimes trips things up when you're dealing with, is something a grant or a gift. In a gift, there's no restrictions on the usage of funds, the time period with which to spend them. And there is no budget that's submitted to the funding agency to say this is exactly how we're going to spend the funds. We can give them an overall idea of, the funds will be spent on this specific field of research, but we don't give them any kind of budget as to this is exactly the things we're going to purchase with these funds. Whereas with a grant, they definitely can require budgets, and they can require that after the termination period, if we don't spend all of the funds on the specific project that they're funding, we would return any unspent funds. The results, I've kind of hit on this a little bit earlier, but this is another sort of area that we can use to differentiate between a grant and a gift. In a gift, the funder allows unspecified results. They're basically funding a specific area of research, perhaps, or funding, a field of science, but there's not a predetermined outcome associated with this donation. Like, they're not anticipating that if you use their money, you're going to come up with this solution to whatever a problem is. Whereas with a grant, the goals of the project are typically very clearly defined, and there are certain objectives that are expected to be met with the grant funds. Another factor that you can use to determine if something's a gift or a grant is research compliance. With a gift, gifts can fund research that, it typically would not require any kind of IRB, IACUC, biosafety, and other research compliance review. And, there would not be any kind of financial conflict of interest that would need to be managed. And, there's no time and effort reporting that would be affected by the gift. However, with the grant, typically these are used for funding specific projects that involve humans or animal subjects. And there's other research compliance questions that might need to be answered. And also there may be a conflict of interest if an individual wants to fund research that, directly affect them and they're part of the university or something like that. So these things need to be identified and looked into. And it definitely does affect time and effort reporting because they are actually paying for the salary of individuals in a lab. So that's one thing that you look at to determine, is it a gift or is it a grant? So I was going to kind of go over some case studies just to kind of, in the real world, what does this look like? So the first case study I was going to talk about, this is sort of just a little made up scenario. So basically the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation is interested in funding research at Texas A&M. Dr. X is contacted by the JDF and the foundation indicates that it wants to give a gift to support Dr. X's research. They suggest that Dr. X submit a proposal to the foundation, and after reviewing the proposal, the JDF is interested in funding the proposal, and they send $100,000 to be spent to fund this research to achieve the outcomes in the proposal. Dr. X has 3 years to conduct the research, after which time any unspent funds will return to JDF. Is this a gift or is it a grant? Now, based on what we had talked about previously, there's several things that make this turn into a grant. First of all, they're interested in his research, but before they'll fund it, they require him to submit a proposal. And this proposal would contain things like a budget, statement of work, desired outcomes, and things of that nature. And they only agree to fund this after they review the proposal, and they're funding him specifically to achieve the outcomes in this proposal. And also, it says that Dr. X has 3 years to conduct this research, and after that time, he's going to return the funds to JDF. So these type of stipulations and caveats make this a grant instead of a gift. The next case study I kind of have here is basically an individual has approached Texas A&M and they're interested in funding Dr. Y due to their research in sustainable agriculture. They want to commit $100,000 a year for 5 years to fund research into sustainable agriculture. And this is in Dr. Y's lab. They only require that the money be spent on research into sustainable agriculture, and they want to be kept aware of how the money is spent. Is this a gift or is it a grant? This would fall into the category of a gift because they do want to restrict it and they want it to be funding research in sustainable agriculture. However, they only require that it be spent in this area and they want to be kept aware of how the money is spent. And we can definitely provide financial accounting to the donor to let them know that this is being spent in the area that they want, but it doesn't have any other restrictions. So this could be classified as a gift. The next case study I have involves a foundation that supports affordable housing, and they're approached by Professor Dr. Z, who conducts research into low-cost construction methodologies. After discussing this with Dr. Z, the foundation is interested in contributing to the work of Dr. Z, and they want to make a gift to the university to sponsor Dr. Z's work. Given the nonprofit mission of the foundation, they only require that any intellectual property that is created using gift funds be given to the public at no charge. So would this be a gift or a grant? On the surface, this looks a lot like a gift, except for the very last requirement. If they make any stipulation as to how intellectual property and inventions that are created with their funding are disposed, then that changes this to a grant instead of a gift. Because it's one thing if they want to say, we want to have the results freely available to the public, that's fine. However, and that's in line with the mission of Texas A&M University, but if they require that any intellectual property, i.e. inventions or anything that Dr. Z comes up with, be given away for free instead of, commercially developed as would be our standard practice, this is a requirement that changes the nature of this to a grant. The processes for gifts and grants are basically handled by two different entities. Texas A&M Foundation processes gifts to the system members. And Texas A&M Foundation has numerous development officers who are in different colleges and different members, and they work directly with the colleges and members to process gifts that are given to those members for specific purposes. Texas A&M Sponsored Research Services processes grants for system members. And that's more in line with the area that I have more expertise in. So I'll focus more on that one as to how we process grants. If something comes in and it's a grant, basically it needs to have a proposal. And this has to be routed so that the sister member entities are alerted as to the nature of the research and the commitments of the faculty and facilities. What are the faculty commitments that they have to be obligated, and also what facilities commitments do we have to obligate in order to accomplish the goals of the grant. The terms of the grant have to be negotiated with the sponsors. Some things that the sponsors want we can do, some things we have to negotiate with them to see if it's things that we can actually do. And the negotiators at Sponsored Research Services work with the PI, the department, and the college to resolve any issues with sponsor terms and conditions. The acceptance process for grants is that basically a grant usually has to be signed by either both parties, or in some cases it can be unilateral, and we agree upon expenditure of the funds that we will agree to the terms in the grant. However, before we can start spending money, the university must agree to the terms in order for the account to be set up and the funding spent. And once the account is set up and the award is accepted, then the funds are utilized and administered in accordance with the terms of the award. Just as a final thought before we take any questions, I wanted to sort of lay out, contacts at SRS and at the foundation for determining if something is a gift or it is a grant. At Texas A&M Sponsored Research Services, you can contact me, and my contact email is right here. Or you can contact Catherine Kissman, my supervisor, and she can provide more guidance on, is something a grant or is it a gift? For dealing with gifts, you can contact the Texas A&M Foundation, and I could list all the different development officers for the different colleges, but each college has its own respective development officer or development team. And you can contact that team, or, if all else fails, you can contact the main line with any questions on gifts. And I've listed that information here. So with that, David, I think I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions that people have. Okay, it says, are indirect costs also are collected from gifts? There are no indirect costs from gifts. Typically, things that are routed from the foundation, I think they assess a 5% fee for processing the gift. That's my understanding. But there is no IDC on gifts. Okay, another question that came in, it says, is there a difference between a gift and a donation? Honestly, a gift and a donation those are sort of the same thing, just under a different name. And sort of, this is the thing that we find in our world. It's like, it doesn't really matter what somebody calls something. It matters what they want. If someone, like, for instance, let's use donation, for example. Let's say an entity wants to donate a piece of equipment to Texas A&M, or they want to donate something of value to Texas A&M. If they donate it to Texas A&M and there are not stipulations on how it will be used, exactly that it will be used for a very specific project, then that's a gift. However, if they give a donation of equipment to a lab here at Texas A&M or one of the system members or whatever, and they say, well, this can only be used on this project, and once you're done using on this project, then you need to send it back. That's not a donation anymore. That's basically, it's something that they're giving you to use for a very specific project. So that's kind of the difference. But honestly, there's not really a difference between a gift and a donation. Either one of those could be considered a gift, depending on what the sponsor stipulations are. I hope that helps.
Travis, this is Carl Muntean, AgriLife Corporate Engagement. Just from our perspective, I wanted to note and ask you guys see this. Just that a company doesn't want to pay IDC is not a good justification for trying to call it gift versus grant. IDCs are things that obviously fund all of the rest of us who supply support services, and just wanted to make sure that was something that's something we've run into as a mechanism that some faculty in some instances have used as trying to get around IDCs and getting more money for their programs.
I cannot agree with you more, Carl.
Understand your perspective on that. Reiterate it again.
No, and I appreciate you for bringing that up, because that is definitely something that people think, well, if I run this as a gift, then I don't have to pay IDC. But that's not appropriate. And actually, I've discussed this with the foundation, and they look for that as well. That, if someone wants to call it a gift just to avoid IDC, and there's stipulations that you have to give these deliverables, there's this all of these things that we just discussed, that's not a gift, and you can't just call it a gift just to avoid paying IDC. So thanks, Carl.
Hey, Travis, a question for you. This is George Gillespie with Technology Commercialization. IP obviously is an ongoing issue. Mentioned that if any terms in the IP are modified, then it is no longer a gift, but it's a grant. Could you give us some other examples of when the IP is modified or somehow, changed from standard procedure?
Well, I mean, it's really if they're making stipulations on IP at all. If they're giving you a gift and they're saying, well, with this gift, we will own any IP that comes out of this. We'll get licensing rights out of any IP that comes out of this. We will get some kind of stipulations on how you can and can't dispose of any, commercial intellectual property that you develop with this gift funds, then that's not a gift anymore. And it changes the color of it. Now, there are things that are, there are entities that have sort of, a philanthropic arm and a research arm, and they can kind of do two different things. Sometimes they'll give stuff with a grant and they'll give stuff with a gift, but the gift had to very clearly say, okay, this is a gift. We're giving this to you to spend on certain type of research or whatever. And that's it. There's not there's not stipulations that, we have to have rights and IP that comes out of it. We have to, things of that nature. That's kind of, that's my understanding of, the difference. And it changes the color of it when they say, okay, this is a gift, but you have to do this, and this for this gift.
Right.
That changes it. It's not a gift anymore.
Right.
So
okay, thank you.
I have a couple more questions. Says one from Jorge Venejas says, can you discuss gifts that are not, money, i.e. land, a vehicle, equipment? Those would be more in line with what we saw with the earlier question about a donation. I mean, it's still a gift. I mean, you can have someone give land, you can have them give a vehicle, you can have them give equipment. And typically things of that nature, depending on if it's a gift or a gift or something else. I mean, it's, and this is probably a better question for the foundation to answer. I mean, typically if you give someone land or a gift, they can specify what the purpose of that is. Like, hey, you're going to use this vehicle for sea turtle research on Texas Gulf Coast. Okay, fine. That's fair. But you can't say, well, if after a certain period of time, you have to give it back, or, if you don't give it back, you have to give us the equivalent amount of funds that it would be worth. Things of that nature change it from being a gift or a donation. I have another question from, looks like Catherine Kissman. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but it says, if a PI wants to provide the donor a copy of a publication that he made that resulted from use of their donation, is that considered deliverable? And her answer is no, as long as it is not a requirement of the receipt of funding, it is not a deliverable. And that's true. Basically, if you have you publish with their funds and you, as being a good steward, want to say, hey, look what we did with your funds, that's fine. However, if it's in the gift agreement that you have to make a publication with these funds, that changes the color of it. These are all good questions. I appreciate these. And I hope I'm answering them appropriately.
One last question. This is Jorge Vanegas. What if it's a mixture of both? Do you have to involve both SRS and the foundation?
Yes, and yes, because we actually run into that all the time, where you have an entity that wants to do a gift, but you also want to do a research project. And basically you have to parse those out into separate buckets, because a gift, like I said, doesn't have the stipulations that a research project would. And this is where, you really, I hate to say it, but this is one of those it depends answers, where you really have to look at the specific question and say, okay, what are they doing with this pot of money, and what are they doing with this pot of money? If they're taking this money and say, hey, we want to fund this building for, to be built on campus, and we want this building to generally be used for, study of, sustainable agriculture, I don't know, whatever, then fair enough, that can be a gift. But if they also say, well, we want to fund sustainable agriculture because we want to actually have you develop, chemical-free pesticides, and this is a company that does that kind of thing. Okay, we need to parse that out as that's going to be a research project. As long as the building that they're funding can be used for basically all kinds of other purposes, not just for their purposes. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, and I have another follow-up.
Mhm.
That is being aware that the system has rules for certain types of donations.
Mhm.
Land, for example, why I ask is that when I was dean of the College of Architecture, we got a lot of offers of gifts for our students to, do designs and things like that. But there are other entities within the system that I think, especially anything that has to do with real estate, facilities, and other things, there are issues of liability with vehicles. There's all kinds of things. So my comment is just basically, you have answered it. We have to go through the proper channels and make sure that you don't make any assumptions on whether it's a gift or a grant. Thank you.
That is completely true, and I appreciate the follow up on that, Dr. Venegas.
Mhm.
Yeah, System Real Estate is somebody who gets involved in those kinds of things, even at the OGC. So Travis, I just wanted to clarify on the AgriLife side, if it is industry wanting to do gifts, I wanted to clarify that that would go through AgriLife Administrative Services and AgriLife contracts rather than you guys at SRS, correct?
Yes, we would end up managing the project down the road,
Right.
but yes, the actual negotiation of the contract, and the same goes for T's. T's, I didn't clarify that, Mark, and thank you, Carl. Basically, the actual negotiation of the contract would go through AgriLife contracts, and for T's, it would go through T's contracts. The management of the project, once everything's in place, would be done at SRS, but the contract would be negotiated. And this is one of those things where once you figure out, okay, if you have questions about whether it's a gift or a grant, then we need to basically involve the contracts office and foundation to say, okay, what is this?
Perfect. Thank you for that clarification.
No problem. No problem.
Question, Travis, another question. If for an industry funded project, is there cases where the IDC is less than the standard rate if some of the work is being done at the industrial site rather than on campus? Is there can the rate be less than, I don't remember what the standard rate is, but can the IDC be reduced?
There are differences. There's an off-campus rate, and and that's something that we can discuss, once you determine this is a research project. Obviously, where things take place, that does affect the IDC. But at the end of the day, like Carl said, we don't want to use a gift to get around paying IDC.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, depending on where something happens on or off campus, that does affect the IDC rate that will be, assessed to the project.
Okay, thank you.
And one other comment that came in, I think Catherine had put this in, it says, if compliance control materials are donated, we must still go through a material transfer process and ensure compliance is approved. And this is something that Dr. Venegas had kind of mentioned as well. We need to go through the process, even if something is quote unquote donated. And the same is true for any export control donation items. We must follow compliance. So, this is something that we have to follow, no matter what's being given, even if it, like you said, land, material, vehicles, etc. It says, okay, I have another question. It says, can a gift be for service and not for research? And yes, like for instance, if you give a gift for a service that A&M or someone would provide, that's true. Again, the same rules still apply. If someone gives a gift to one of the A&M members, and this gift is for, to provide some kind of general thing that you're doing for the betterment of Texas, would be a service as opposed to research. If they don't have specific deliverables and other things that we just mentioned previously, then yes, that could be considered a gift. However, when they start getting into, there are specific deliverables, certain qualifications that have to be met, et cetera, that changes the color of it to being a grant instead of a gift.
Hey, Travis.
Mm-hmm.
This is Sabrina from AgriLife.
Sabrina.
I did just want to jump on that as well and clarify that when the question says services, do you guys distinguish between services like you're saying here as a service to the general public and those funds are to go to that, and services such as testing services and research?
Yes, and that's very different, because basically if you're providing testing services, that's a quid pro quo. That's not something that would be a gift. And that's what I guess maybe I misunderstood when someone was asking about service. If it's testing services, that's not something that would be a gift. In my understanding of this is that basically if we're providing, because that gets to where we're providing something of value to them for the funds that they're paying us. as opposed to, they're paying us to, do something for the service of, doing something for the betterment of people of Texas, and they're not expecting anything in return, then that would be a gift.
Thanks, Travis, for that. That's our understanding as well.
Yeah. I have another question from Carl. He says, I think it's more of a comment, but he says, and ultimately IDCs are decided at the agency university level and not at SRS. Is that correct? And that is correct. I mean, that's something that basically, the decision to decide what the ultimate IDC is on a project does rest with the agency. And that's why, things have to be routed through the proper channels, and we have to route proposals that are grants. We have to route things through, and the agency decides if there is going to be a waiver of IDC, then that's something that the agency has to agree to.
Travis, this is Catherine. I just wanted to mention that with regard to the IDC rates as relative to whether they're on or off campus, that would follow the definitions and rates that are in the system F&A rate agreement. And then with regard to specific research projects, and if a researcher is requesting a reduced rate or a reduced IDC rate that's lower than those approved rates, then that would be handled by the member.
Yes. That's something they would have to approve. All right. I think I got all the questions. They were coming in fast. That's good. I appreciate that.